Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special presentation of the Speaker Series of the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission. My name is Stéphane Richard. I'm the Director of Stakeholder and Intergovernmental Relations for the Department of Infrastructure and Housing. I want to thank you all for joining us during your lunch break. I have a feeling you won't regret it. I also want to thank many members of the Commission and its subcommittees and working groups for being with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while we are gathered in this virtual environment, most of us online have the pleasure of living and working in Mi'kmaq, the unceded territory and ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq Nation. In Nova Scotia, we recognize that we are all treaty people. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming a world-class researcher and international lecturer on housing issues, Dr. Carolyn Whitzman. Dr. Whitzman will do her presentation and then she will be happy to take your questions. I hope you came prepared. To ask questions, please use the raise hand feature. I believe that's available under reactions, and depending on your version, maybe some of you will find the feature under participants. If you have any issues, please use the chat room maybe to write down your question. At this time, because I'm really pleased to see the number of people that have joined us today. But I would ask you to mute yourself so that we don't have feedback and it's just easier for everyone. That said, to make a more formal introduction, I am pleased to welcome Aaron Devereaux, the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and Housing and our new co-chair of the Affordable Housing Commission. Deputy, take it away.
Thanks, Stefan. So good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to join you today and to introduce our guest speaker. As just mentioned, my name is Aaron Devereaux, and I'm the new Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and Housing with the Government of Nova Scotia. So this is day number 5 for me in my new role. So I am quickly getting up to speed on the many challenges and the great work being undertaken by all those involved in this shared vision of creating affordable housing for Nova Scotians. So a bit about me. I was born and raised in Nova Scotia and certainly appreciate the importance of investment in the housing sector. Previously, I've lived in Canada's Northern Arctic region for over the past 12 years as part of a senior management team with the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. I've also have experience in the private sector in the housing industry in Nova Scotia with a large developer that allowed me to gain additional insight into the importance of housing to the well-being of a community. So I'm honored to serve as the co-chair of the Affordable Housing Commission, and I look forward to working with this diverse group of community leaders and housing experts who have been fully dedicated over the last 4 months to understand the growing challenges relating to housing supply and rising costs. We were pleased to hear in the recent speech from the throne in which housing and the important work of the Affordable Housing Commission were highlighted. This government has indicated its support and commitment to the need for investment in affordable housing. So through our stakeholder engagement process, the Affordable Housing Commission is gathering critical insights from Nova Scotians. And if you haven't already done so, I invite you to visit our website at novascotiaaffordablehousing.ca for more information about upcoming online workshops and other ways you can provide input. I also encourage you, if you haven't done so, to complete our online survey. Your perspectives will help inform the recommendations the Commission will make to the Minister later this spring. So with that, let's now turn our attention to our amazing guest speaker. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Carolyn Whitzman, an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa and an author, co-author, or editor of 5 books related to the right to the city in both a contemporary and historical perspective. She's also the author or co-author of over 50 book chapters, articles, and published conference presentations on housing policy, children's independent mobility, women's safety, and disability rights. Dr. Whitzman also often provides policy advice to local, provincial, national government entities, as well as to the United Nations. In 2016, she was invited to make a keynote address as part of the Habitat 3 conference in Ecuador. Given the mandate of our Affordable Housing Commission, we have asked Dr. Whitzman today to speak to us about her research on global housing policies, with a particular focus on collaborative partnerships for affordable housing. We hope you all had a chance to take a quick look at her previous work and have prepared some questions for her. There'll be a few minutes at the end of the presentation today for some questions. So without further ado, Dr. Whitzman, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have to speak to you all today. My family originally hails from Halifax, although that was a generation ago. So before I go any further, I'd like to begin by being able to move my, there we go, by acknowledging the fact that I am presenting today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Their stolen land became the basis of speculative wealth for settlers and homelessness for this First Nation and many others. They held land in common. They built multifamily longhouses to stay warm and support community in winter. In the summer, they were adept at creating housing from local materials near their agricultural and hunting work. I think we have a lot to learn from their housing practices then and now. What I'm going to be talking about in the next 20 minutes or so is a little bit of national context for what's going on across Canada. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of needs assessment and also a gender and intersectional analysis. And I'm going to focus in on 3 priorities that I want to suggest, maybe things that the Nova Scotia Affordable Housing Commission look at. The first is retaining affordable housing that already exists. The second is scaling up social housing. And the third is the importance of setting and keeping to targets. Throughout, I'm going to be referring to a couple of partnerships. Before 2019, I was based in Melbourne, Australia, and I'll be talking a little bit about the Affordable Housing Partnership I led there. And I'll also be talking a little bit about some work in British Columbia that I find very exciting. So in terms of the national context, in January of 2018, the National Housing Strategy was released, and that was great. It was a return of federal leadership after 3 decades, but the right to housing did not underpin that strategy. The goals were to have homelessness by 2030, not to eliminate it gradually or otherwise, which would be the basis of a rights-based strategy. There wasn't any consideration in that strategy of the loss of private rental affordability, even though research shows that 15 units were lost for every new social unit created between 2011 and 2016. And now, unfortunately, under COVID, there's the concern that homelessness is being created faster, that it's being fixed. There was also a big focus on rent subsidies for the private sector, but not necessarily on the right supply. And I'll be unpacking that a bit further. The year later, 2019, the National Housing Strategy Act was enacted by Parliament, and that actually did put the right to housing into Canadian legislation. And not only Canadian legislation, but also provincial and municipal legislation. There was within that act a focus on the most vulnerable and on progressive elimination of homelessness. And there was also the creation of a national housing advocate who hasn't yet been announced, but the National Housing Council has been created, and that council is supposed to include those with lived experience of homelessness. Last year, of course, COVID-19 both exposed the impacts of housing injustices and created much greater risk of homelessness. We already knew that 1/3 of renters across Canada have less than 1 month's savings. So if they lose employment, they're at risk of eviction. But as the Deputy Minister mentioned, there was a very exciting announcement, not only in the Nova Scotia throne speech, but also in the Canadian throne speech in September of 2020, which was that Canada officially aimed to end homelessness by 2030. So as you can see, there's been 3 game changers in 3 years. What's next? Well, what seems to be coalescing is a vision. The CMHC has said by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and meets their need. That's their goal. The throne speech, as I mentioned several months ago, said that the Canadian government was eliminated to eradicating homelessness by 2030. And what that means is that homelessness would be rare and speedily resolved and non-recurrent. There are countries such as Finland that are very close to that goal. It also means adequate housing for all Canadians, not just affordable, but in decent repair and not overcrowded. What will need to happen in order for us as Canadians to reach that vision by 2030 is that all levels of government will need to recognize the right to adequate housing. And that begins with a shared definition of affordable housing and of homelessness. It goes on to have complementary policies and targets. It includes independent monitoring, and it also includes access to justice and ombudsman at every level of government to make sure that governments are living up to their commitments. And it very much means attention to those who are most marginalized, and that includes a separate, fully funded, Indigenous-led strategy, which the federal government has said that they will be undertaking but is not yet official, and a gender and intersectional analysis and sub-targets, which the Canadian government has already done in relation to women-led households. There we go. I want to start with a basic fact, which is that homelessness is a political choice that makes no economic sense. It costs much less to provide continuing, including continuing supportive housing to people who are homeless than to have folks in hospital beds, shelters, or jails. Which does beg the question, affordable housing for whom? Traditionally, the CMHC and most governments have used as a basis of housing need or affordable housing that households are not spending more than a proportion of their household income. Currently, it's 30%. And that is true, especially for low-income families that are in the first 2 quintiles of household income. So that means less than 80% of median income, which is usually measured by an area such as a province or a city. There is some debate about whether it should include utilities and transport. Certainly, the definition of housing need includes not living in overcrowded, basically more than 1 person per bedroom, or in a house in poor repair. However, a number of CMHC-supported programs often use the definition of affordable housing that's based on 100% or 80% of area market rent, or even worse with the Rental Housing Finance Initiative, which uses a definition of affordable housing that's a great deal above median rent. The problem is that the area median rent for Halifax is a little over $1,000 a month, but the shelter allowance for a single person is $586 a month. So that's almost twice as much as the shelter allowance. If you're looking at, say, a single mom with 2 kids, the median rent, the market rent, would be about $1,200 a month for a 2-bedroom. But if that single parent was working at a full-time minimum wage job, they'd be earning $1,295, and the affordable rent that they'd be able to pay if they were working full-time would be about $673 per month. So in other words, looking at market rate has nothing to do with meeting the needs of the 50% of low-income people who are presently in housing need, or housing stress, as it's sometimes called. Also, when we look at homelessness, we need to expand our definitions. So quite often we look at street counts, so people who are living rough. But where are the women? We know that women are generally lower income than men. Finland, the country that's come closest to eliminating homelessness, estimates that 70% of people who are homeless are hidden from sight. They're not in shelters and they're not sleeping rough. Emergency shelters aren't adequate housing. You have to leave during the day. There's no security of your possessions, no security of tenure. It is not within the definition of adequate housing. Even transitional housing is short-term and there's no security of tenure. But the majority of people who would be considered homeless by many international definitions are sleeping with family and friends, they're doubling up with other households, they're in violence against women shelters, they're staying in violence relationships because of the fear of losing their home or their children. They're dealing with harassing landlords, they're involuntarily institutionalized. Those too are people who are homeless. Now, I spoke earlier of the housing partnership that I led for 6 years in Melbourne. Basically, it involved the state government, the equivalent of the local, of the provincial government, local governments, private developers, nonprofit developers, social finance folks, and mainstream finance folks. And we started off with the basic question: what do you need to know to create more affordable housing? And amongst our achievements in those 6 years was it soon became very clear that we needed to start off with the basics. We needed to start off at the state level with a common definition of affordable housing that all local governments, all developers, all finance people could use and understand. So we came up with a new income category-based definition of affordable housing. There hadn't previously been an official definition. And also we worked with to include affordable housing as an aim of the Planning Act. The next project that we did was we mapped government land for suitability for affordable housing. And that became the basis for local government housing plans. And the third thing that we did was we built alliances between social finance, local government, and developers, and helped evaluate pilot projects, such as a pilot project that's illustrated here, which was a new rooming house built above a municipal parking lot on free leased land. This idea of needs assessment isn't new. Singapore, which was a very poor country, recently independent after colonialism in 1966, did a housing needs assessment. It found that a large proportion of people were overcrowded and living in substandard conditions. It judged that a great deal of the central city would need to be redeveloped, and houses that were there would need to be lost because they were substandard. And it also projected a natural increase in the population, fairly large because there were large families over the 10 years, the first 10 years of the Housing Development Board. And it came up with a figure, 147,000 new homes needed. That means that Singapore was committed to building 14,000 new homes a year or more. And that's what needs assessment is at its most basic level, taking a look at the deficit of adequate housing, taking a look at the projected net loss or gain of affordable housing over the time period of the plan, so what's likely to not remain affordable, and taking a look at the projected population growth and change over the period of a plan, quite often 10 years. Many cities, many provinces and states have used household income categories. For instance, Vancouver, the state of California, and now the state of Victoria in Australia. Usually there are a number of categories. I would suggest that there be a very low income category that's about 20% of area median income, that there be a low income category that's about 50%, 20 to 50% of median area median income. Another way of calculating it is looking at the population of people who are reliant on shelter allowance for very low income and one full-time minimum wage job as the equivalent of low income. Moderate income, which is usually 50 to 80% of the area income, or if you want to think of it in terms of a person, the starting salary of a teacher or a nurse. An average income of 80 to 100% of median income, and then a higher income category. Usually the focus is on the first two income categories, who are most likely to be in housing stress. Quite often these days in, for instance, Vancouver or Toronto, you also have to look at affordability for moderate and even average income households. And this idea of looking at household income instead of market rent means that you can't afford to pay more if you have a larger household, but you may need a larger place. So you need to break down the proportion of people in housing need by income category, and then you need to break it down by family size. And again, if you move beyond the cliched image of a homeless person as a single man with substance abuse or mental health issues, you end up realizing that a lot of new migrants and refugee claimants, Indigenous families, racialized families are in housing need, but they aren't one-person households. So generally, it makes sense to aim for about 30% studio or one-bedroom units, about 35% two-bedroom units, and about 35% three or more bedroom units. I've talked a bit about gender and intersectional analysis. That means that you have to further break down need by the proportion of, for instance, Indigenous people, as well as the need for a for Indigenous by Indigenous strategy. And also you need to look at larger homes because sometimes Indigenous households have extended families. You need to look at the proportion of female-led households, including data from Violence Against Women Services of people who are, for instance, moving out from a violent relationship, but hopefully staying within the same community so that their children don't have to change schools. And again, women's housing may need, if there's children involved, larger homes and also nearby services. You need to look at the proportion of Black households and more generally people of color households. Quite often in Nova Scotia's past, for instance, with Africville, there's been displacement of lower income racialized communities as cities have redeveloped. You need to look at the proportion of new migrant and refugee people. You need to look at the proportion of people with disability, and of course, universal access for people with mobility issues. Also included in that category would be people who are dealing with mental illness or addiction. And quite often those folks are in need of supports along with their housing. You need to look at the proportion of LGBTQI two-spirited people, especially young people who may be moving out of foster care and older people in terms of service needs. And you need to look at age, again, focusing on people who are moving out of foster care and also at 60, 65 or older. And it's really important to have supportive housing with services in order to allow people to stay in their homes for as long as possible as they get older. So once you have a sense of housing need, you can come up with a series of targets. It may make sense to look at median income in terms of Halifax and the rest of the province. That's what we did in Victoria, or you may want to use the median income figure, which is 55.9 household income in Nova Scotia to calculate this. But what you'll probably end up with is a number of households, a large number of households who need rents at about $500 a month. And that's going to be very, very hard without both construction subsidy and operating subsidy or some form of rent allowance. You'll come up with a figure that for houses that need to be rented or homes that need to be rented at about $750 a month. Those are the kinds of homes below $750 that are being lost very rapidly across Canada. You'll also need to come up with a figure, perhaps, of homes that are available at $1,200 a month rent. And then you need to look at average and higher household incomes. And you can do the same calculation for mortgage payments for home ownership, but certainly in many cities, home ownership is out of reach for very low and low income households. So as I mentioned, there's been a net loss, a huge net loss of what we call NOAH, naturally occurring affordable homes, private sector homes. And that's because there's been large-scale conversion of multifamily rental to ownership through gentrification. There's been a lot of rent eviction, tenants evicted to raise rents, and there's been the growth of short-term rental platforms such as Airbnb, as well as vacancies in investment properties. And you also need to keep in mind that there's inefficiencies in housing stock. So simply saying one person per bedroom might not work. Sometimes there's relatively wealthy households renting cheap accommodation for various reasons, including landlords preferring to rent to them. You can't throw them out. You have people working from home, or they have shared custody. They might need extra rooms for visiting children. And you have, for instance, in social housing, households earning higher income over time, or their children move out and they become empty nesters, but they remain in larger or cheaper homes if they paid the mortgage off and they're homeowners. And again, in a democratic society, you can't throw them out. So those are the things you need to look at as you set targets for those who are most in need. So there's three priorities I'm going to suggest to you. You have to stop the hemorrhage of well-located affordable housing. And I note that Nova Scotia has recently strengthened rent control, has brought in a rent freeze during COVID, is talking about retaining rental properties, talking about ending evictions into homelessness. That's a really, really big part of what the province needs to do. There's also the challenge of acquiring as many properties as possible and keeping it as social housing. The federal government is currently looking at an expansion of the Rapid Housing Initiative. Certainly the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has called for an acquisitions program, as took place in many places in the 1970s. There have been calls since 1944 for Canada to scale up nonprofit housing to at least a third of all homes. And by calls, I mean federal commissions saying that needs to happen. How can that happen? One possibility is using all available government land and leasing it out as social housing. And I'm talking about lands at all three levels of government. I'm talking about the growth of community land trusts, which are entities that are committed to keeping housing affordable in perpetuity. I'm talking about scaling up housing first programs, such as the Rapid Housing Initiative. And I'm talking about layering rent supplements onto social housing so that the lowest income households can live there affordably. And then the third priority is new market construction, particularly purpose-built rental and what we call gentle density, or intensifying single-family zoned areas. And tackling housing speculation is really difficult. There's vacancy taxes, there's wealth taxes, and at some point we need to look at the huge, huge imbalance of subsidies that are given by the federal government to homeowners as compared to renters. So let's look at that first priority. How do you stop the hemorrhage of naturally occurring affordable housing? Well, one thing that a lot of jurisdictions are doing are limiting short-term rental to properties that are occupied by their owner 200 days a year, so that you can rent out part of your property or the whole of your property, but only for a short period of time. There have been tens of thousands of rental properties lost to the rental market, the long-term rental market, through short-term rental. It's been a real issue, and it's being tackled internationally. Another big issue is rooming houses. That's usually the housing of last resort for lowest income people. It's really important to include rooming houses in rent control legislation. They aren't right now in many jurisdictions, and to look at not losing any more. The City of Vancouver has done some really good work about acquiring single room occupancy hotels. You have to be able to ban the conversion of rental to ownership, or at least replace the low cost rentals when conversion takes place. You have to look at rent banks and alternatives to eviction, because it's much, much, much more expensive to try to find new housing for people once they've been evicted into homelessness. You need to continue with rent controls and ban the practice of being able to raise rents to market rate once the unit is vacant. And you have to keep track of tenants and buildings at risk of rent eviction. And that means, as is the case in Montreal, having the right of first refusal for properties for sale and an acquisition strategy. In terms of the second priority, scaling up nonprofit, there are a lot of reports, and I'm just going to try to briefly summarize how to make nonprofit cheaper. First of all, using all suitable land, not just government land, but also church land, agency land, and lease it for nonprofit housing. That's happening in Vancouver right now. You have to be able to offer technical support to nonprofit housing associations. BC and Quebec have been doing that for many years. The federal government used to do it in the 80s. You have to be able to review zoning with an affordable overlay, and I'll get to that in a moment, and ease parking restrictions, which can be up to 27% of the cost. Many cities are doing that. You have to be able to support community land trusts because that allows nonprofits to bundle their assets and then go to a bank with scaled up assets and get low interest loans. And there are places that are adjusting land boundaries in order to get a more industrialized approach to social housing, and that really brings down costs as well. So again, this is very complicated stuff, and I'm going to refer to some reports at the end, but there was a report that came out just this week about getting to the sweet spot, which is unsubsidized market rental, unsubsidized rental. Actually, it's social rental in Vancouver, which is the most overinflated property market in Canada. How do you do it? Well, the biggest cost savings that you can do is take out the profit, and so use social developers, and social developers are scaling up to take on that challenge in BC right now. You have to use free land. That can be 15 to 30% of the cost of housing. There's a lot of interest in modular construction. At the moment, it's not a huge cost saving. It can be a huge time saving, particularly in the north, where the construction season is limited, the on-site construction season is limited. 42% of Swedish housing is modular. That's how they scaled up, built 1 million homes in the 60s. It's worth taking a look at. As I say, greatly reducing parking requirements, especially where public transit is good, where there's car share programs. Certainly in BC, using wood, not concrete, even in places that don't have lots of trees, concrete has a lot of problems in the long term. Using low or no interest construction financing, that's where the province and the feds can really help out. Providing technical assistance, I've already mentioned. Definitely accelerating approvals of nonprofit and other low-income housing, and giving development charge and GST relief. These are all things that can make a huge difference. And all of this work in BC comes out of amazing partnerships. And I just want to mention the involvement of Landlords BC. So that's private sector landlords, BC Seniors Living Association, and the University of British Columbia, which is SCARP, in developing the Affordable Housing Action Plan for BC, which came out before the 2017 election in BC and immediately got translated into the provincial strategy. And that in turn led to literally thousands of new deeply affordable units being built in recent years in BC. So that's partnerships that really work. I'll talk briefly about Housing First. That's quickly providing independent, permanent housing to homeless people, along with services instead of requiring treatment first. Many provinces, including Alberta, have been taking a Housing First approach. The Rapid Housing Initiative, recently announced and enacted by the federal government, is a Housing First approach. It's amazing what you can do. There were 660 homes in 18 months built in the city of Vancouver. And again, it takes integrated, coordinated work by all levels of government. Infrastructure funding from the federal government, services provided by the provincial government, and land provided by the municipal government. We need to take a long, hard look at exclusionary zoning. There has been redlining, which is mortgages, difficulty in getting mortgages for certain groups of people, certain areas. Zoning is based in racist, classist, sexist, exclusionary principles. The majority of most large cities in Canada are zoned for single detached properties. That needs to change for environmental, social, and economic reasons. I particularly like the way that the city of Portland did it because they give density bonuses for 4 to 6 unit properties where half of them are deeply affordable. That allows social housing to get into neighborhoods that they quite often well-served neighborhoods that they've been excluded from until now. You can restrict the maximum size of new homes. As I say, you can allow 4 to 6 units on one property, or cottages or tiny homes on properties. You can get rid of on-site parking requirements, and all of these together can bring deep affordability into some well-served areas. I'll end on the topic of targets, just give you a sense of what's going on internationally. For about 2 decades now, France has had targets of 20% in all municipalities need to be social, and they actually fine municipalities who aren't achieving that target. In Paris, it's now 25% of all housing should be social. They're at 17% now. They want to get to 25 by 2030. In Hamburg, Germany, the target is 1,600 homes a year, a third social, a third rent regulated, a third private market. In Montreal, 20% social housing for all new developments over 5 units. 20% have to be 3+ bedroom. In Vancouver, there's a long-standing concern for family-sized housing downtown. The current targets are 35% family housing, of which 10% are 3+ bedrooms. Sweden, as I say, managed to build 1 million social homes in a decade when it was much poorer than it is now, and the population was 5 million as opposed to Canada's 38 million. Singapore did meet its housing needs in 10 years post-independence when it was quite poor in a new country, so it can be done. And this illustration is income-based housing targets in Vancouver. Canadians are ready to end homelessness. It can be done by 2030. The majority of Canadians support it. So I leave you with this challenge, a number of references if you want to read further, and I'm now ready to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Whitzman. A lot of food for thought and to consider. And I think what I've heard over the last few minutes is really in line with a lot of the questions that commission members and our subcommittees and also from our engagement platform. A lot of stakeholders have provided input and around this need for a common definition of affordable housing. So I will now let people that have listened intently and have questions. So folks, if you want to just kind of use that raised hand feature under, if you're not familiar with Zoom, I believe it's under reactions, and or if you have an older version or different version, you can find it under chat and just raise your hand and I'll come to you. But to get us started, since I have the mic and I have a little bit of control, I'll ask my first question. Dr. Whitzman, you make the case for a greater proportion of non-market housing. In Nova Scotia, we haven't achieved the same level of capacity that we are seeing in BC, for example, in other jurisdictions. And while we're building that capacity, The private sector is playing a key role and plays a key role in adding new supply, and we need new supply now, some would argue. I'm wondering if you've seen partnerships where private sector is part of projects that brings kind of more affordable housing to market, but also works with government and other partners to help build that capacity in the community housing sector. I don't know if you've seen anything or if you have any advice on. So while we need new supply now and private sector is the key player, at least in the Nova Scotia context, what role can the private sector play as we build that capacity?
That's a really good question to start with, Stefan. I'm relatively tenure neutral between rental and home ownership, and also relatively neutral in terms of whether the developer is private or social. However, there are two things that need to be taken into account. The first is that developers are by definition, private developers are by definition for profit. And so you really are looking at absolutely expertise, absolutely capacity to scale, but you're also looking at 18 to 20% profit usually. So the real key issue is, can you bring housing in at X price? And as I say, in Vancouver, there was a very strong reliance on private sector developers for a very long time through inclusionary zoning and through public-private partnerships. But recently, there's been a move towards scaling up social developers, which does take time. It's taken at least a decade in Vancouver, simply because it can be brought in cheaper. And here's the second criteria. You want to use government resources effectively. You want the housing to be affordable in perpetuity. Quite often agreements with developers, private developers, are for 10 years, maybe 20 years if you're lucky. If you have a community land trust that holds the land, it's supposed to be affordable in perpetuity. And really, we're starting to see the cost of even 30-year mortgages coming through, and then you've got, are we going to be keeping that affordable? The best way to keep things affordable in perpetuity are governments leasing land, community land trusts, and social housing providers. So that's what I'd say. Having said that, many examples of really, really innovative private developers. I am thinking specifically of a developer in Portland who used tax credits and not only built a wonderful affordable housing building for families, but also approached the local school board who were looking for a site for a primary school and put the primary school downstairs. And that was on that company's own accord. So you can see really, really wonderful work. It's not whether it's private or public, it's coming in at a certain price point, which is really difficult. I see that Myra put a question in chat. Did you see it? And Celeste as well.
Thank you, Myra. So thank you. She's saying thank you for the very clear presentation of many overlapping and complex issues. Various cities are mentioned throughout the presentation. However, Nova Scotia has a relatively high rate of rural populations. What are the considerations to take into account in regard to affordable housing and rental housing development and operation in rural as well as urban areas? Are there important distinctions to consider between rural and urban housing? What a wonderful question.
It really is a wonderful question. Thank you, Myra. Absolutely, I was focusing on large cities because that's where the largest numbers of people in housing stress are. However, there can be very high proportions of people in housing stress in rural areas. To some extent, organizing partnerships in rural areas can be as simple as getting together in the Tim Hortons. And that's the wonderful thing about rural areas. I've seen amazing work, for instance, in Prince Edward County, which is not that far from me in Ontario, through just groups working together in traditional service mechanism ways. There can be a bit of an issue in rural areas with getting scale. Quite often the social housing projects are very small, 12 units, and they can be quite expensive per home. The other thing to keep in mind is that some rural areas have a lot of second homes, vacation homes, that are unaffordable to local people living there and, for instance, working service jobs. So one possibility is looking at vacancy taxes. That doesn't mean not allowing second homes, but it does mean having a vacancy tax on those second homes. And also looking at workforce population housing to make sure that people who are earning lower income can still afford to live there. I hope that gives you some directions.
Great, thank you. We'll go next to the question from Celeste and then Peter. Celeste asks, how do we balance the need for affordable housing while ensuring it is also safe, adequate, and appropriate at the same time? Not all affordable housing is adequate.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely the challenge. And there are some who argue that the best is the enemy of the good, in that a lot of CMHC programs have very high expectations in terms of energy efficiency, universal access, etc. Having said that, when you're creating a building, it's for the long term. And that comes back to the point I was making earlier, to the question that Stefan asked, which is that you don't want to put a lot of money into a property that will only be affordable for 10 years. And similarly, these days, you don't want to be putting a lot of money into a new property that is not going to be energy efficient or is not going to be accessible for an aging population. So sometimes you have to spend just a little bit more to make sure that you're building for the long term. In terms of existing houses and acquisitions, there definitely need to be money available to add energy efficiency and to add a certain measure of accessibility to existing rental buildings, and not necessarily to reject acquiring a property because it isn't energy efficient or it isn't accessible, but to add that on. There's also the possibility in the 1990s in Ontario, there was a program that gave loans to homeowners to renovate an accessory unit within their home in return for certain guaranteed rents. You can look at programs like that.
Great, thank you very much. We're going to go to Peter next. Peter, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. And Dr. Whitzman, I was just wondering, so we're a private development company in Halifax, and we build apartments and condominiums. It was with interest when I heard you say that you think, putting aside the time frame, but that the profit motivation and the profit margin kind of drives the rents, and with a 10 to 20% margin. I was just wondering if anybody has done any sort of study or analysis and looked at it from the perspective of trying to get the best of both worlds. So you have the cost minimization and efficiency of a private development company, property management company, combined with the other benefits that are generally afforded to nonprofits. So if you start to make the list to try to level the playing field, and you say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Private Developer, we'll give you the land, we'll give you the equity, we'll give you a loan at between 0 and a sub-market interest rate. We'll waive the permitting fees. We'll give you additional planning considerations that you wouldn't normally get. You'll get back either 100% or at worst 50% of all of your sales taxes, which is in Nova Scotia 15% of the cost of the home. In perpetuity, you have no property tax, no income tax, and on an ongoing basis on your operating costs, you get back between 50 at a minimum and 100% of the sales taxes on your operating expenses. What can you put the unit out to the market for? Because my guess, based on my knowledge of my cost structure, is I could literally cut my rent in half and still own the building and operate at a profit. So I just wonder if anybody has, this is kind of a hypothetical thing, but to challenge the concept that the profit margin is what's driving the effort towards the nonprofits. If you give the business the same assets and tools to work with that the nonprofits have, has anybody looked at the mathematics on that?
Thanks, Peter.
Absolutely, Peter. You're bringing up some really good points here. So the low-income housing tax credit in the US, they will be extended to both private developers and to nonprofit developers. And furthermore, there can be a private developer and a nonprofit manager, which is a sort of hybrid model, particularly if there are supports associated with it. And that works pretty well. I agree with you that the bottom line is, what's the rent you're going to charge? So absolutely, you can cut costs through, at least theoretically, through going with a nonprofit developer. But the other side of that is that you might, there's been 30 years of defunding social housing across Canada. So most nonprofit developers aren't ready for to take on scale. So you absolutely can work with private developers. You absolutely can provide those kinds of sweeteners in terms of keeping down the cost. But I think the bottom line is that you have to have a price point, a rent, let's say, and that you need to regulate it over a long period of time. I'd say about 50 years, really, to make it worthwhile. And if there is a private developer who comes in with the right price point and the right design that meets the criteria, absolutely go with the private developer.
Thank you very much to both. We only have about 4 minutes left to our session. I'm looking at the comments. There are some questions. What I'm going to commit to folks is take all of your questions, and I'm going to email Dr. Whitzman and hope that she'll be kind enough to maybe offer a glimpse of an answer to you after this. But I think Lisa had her hand up. I don't know if Lisa, you're still, if you can make it really, really quick, go for it.
Sure, I'll try to be very quick. So I'm currently working within a rural context. I've been working in an urban context in establishing coordinated access systems, which just helps map out homelessness and housing issues, and more recently doing it in a rural context. And I see two kind of issues with developing housing. And one is that there isn't, because of the low vacancy rates, there isn't a strong way for tenants who are facing discrimination or facing these like rental increases or under the table issues with their landlords to really have a platform to be able to place complaints. And I find that like the provincial government makes decisions based on receiving those complaints. However, tenants can then be blacklisted from being able to have access to housing if they place those complaints. So I'm wondering if we can, like, at least maybe in some of the planning moving forward, have that as a perspective, because those people's voices aren't being heard and the actual issues that are happening on the ground when it comes to housing. My second concern is, and maybe I'd like to hear your feedback, I think more on this, is if we have a government saying that housing is in fact a human right, access to housing is a human right, then how does it work when we have financialized it so much? And if that's the case, like, then how do we, I guess, how are we in a rural context with agencies who are development in areas where land is incredibly expensive and they're not even funded to do the jobs that they're currently trying to do? That's where my concerns are, and I'd love to hear some of your feedback around that.
Yeah, so you've asked a really challenging question, but I think it's going to have to be the last question. The two things that I'd say is that part of a rights basis, which to deal with the kinds of structural issues that you pointed out. I guess the other thing that I'd say is, again, where land costs are really high, it's really important to utilize as much nonprofit land as you can, including building sometimes above services, above churches, above fire halls, above parking lots. I've seen all of that happen, and it can happen, and help deal with the land cost issue. I think I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, I'm really glad that people are so active in asking questions. I'll try to get back to folks. And I'm very happy to come to Halifax once the Atlantic bubble lifts.
Well, thank you so much, and we can't wait for the border to be open and meet in person. That's for sure. Dr. Whitzman, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. Unfortunately, folks, that's all the time we have. But we really appreciate, Dr. Whitzman, your generosity. You've provided us with some great information. I look forward to seeing how the commission will be able to incorporate this as part of their work. Everyone on the call or on the Zoom, thank you very much for spending your lunch hour with us. And I invite you to go to our website. If you haven't done it already, please go and fill out the survey and provide input. This is really important for our work. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.